November 3rd, 1944, somewhere above the German frontier. At nearly 25,000 feet, the sky over Europe was filled with silver contrails stretching toward the horizon. Hundreds of American bombers were returning from another raid deep inside the Third Reich, while their fighter escorts searched constantly for any sign of the Luftwaffe. Among them flew a young United States Army Air Forces pilot named Bruce W. Carr. To the men of his squadron, Carr was known for two things. He was an exceptionally skilled pilot, and he had absolutely no interest in doing things the ordinary way. Neither he nor anyone else knew that before the day ended, he would accomplish one of the most unbelievable escapes ever recorded during the Second World War. Not by fighting his way home, not by hiding, but by flying directly out of Germany in one of Germany's own fighters. Bruce Carr had always seemed perfectly suited for aviation. Born in rural America, he grew up fascinated by engines, speed, and anything that flew. Like thousands of young men after attack on Pearl Harbor, he volunteered for military service, determined to become a fighter pilot. Flight instructors quickly noticed his confidence. Sometimes, too much confidence. He pushed aircraft harder than regulations recommended. He enjoyed low-altitude flying. He loved aerobatics. More than once, instructors warned him that confidence and recklessness often looked identical. Carr listened politely, then climbed back into the cockpit. By late 1944, he had been assigned to fly the legendary North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang had transformed the air war over Europe. Unlike earlier Allied fighters, it possessed the range necessary to escort heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Its powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it exceptional speed. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns could shred enemy aircraft within seconds. Most importantly, it finally allowed Allied bombers to travel with continuous fighter protection. For German pilots, the appearance of long-range Mustangs changed everything. That morning's mission appeared routine. Escort the bombers. Engage enemy fighters if necessary. Return to England. Simple. On paper. Reality rarely followed paper. As the bomber stream crossed into German airspace, reports of enemy aircraft began arriving over the radio. Bandits, 11 o'clock. Then another. 12 high. Within moments, the sky erupted into organized chaos. Silver Mustangs dived toward dark shapes climbing through scattered clouds. The Luftwaffe had arrived. Carr spotted one of the German fighters breaking toward the bombers. Without hesitation, he pushed the throttle fully forward. The Mustang surged ahead. The distance closed rapidly. His gun sight settled behind the enemy aircraft. He squeezed the trigger. 6 Browning machine guns roared simultaneously. Tracer rounds crossed the sky. The German fighter suddenly rolled away, trailing smoke. But before Carr could confirm the victory, another warning exploded through his headset. Brake! Brake! Too late. Heavy cannon fire slammed into his aircraft. The cockpit shook violently. Warning lights illuminated the instrument panel. The Merlin engine immediately began losing power. Oil pressure dropped. Smoke poured across the windshield. Carr instinctively searched for another attacker. He found none. The German pilot had already disappeared. The damage had been done. For several desperate seconds, Carr fought to keep the Mustang level. The controls felt heavy. The engine sputtered violently. Black smoke streamed behind the aircraft. He knew the signs. He wasn't flying home. The nearest Allied territory remained far beyond gliding distance. Below him, only occupied Europe. He calmly transmitted his position over the radio, then prepared to abandon the aircraft. No pilot wanted to leave a Mustang. But dead men didn't fly. The canopy released. Freezing air exploded into the cockpit. Carr rolled the aircraft slightly, unfastened his harness. For one brief moment, he looked back across the instrument panel. Pilots often developed strange emotional attachments to their airplanes. This one had carried him safely through countless missions. Now, it was dying. He pushed himself into empty sky. The silence surprised him. One moment, the world consisted of roaring engines and machine guns. The next, only rushing wind. His parachute opened with a violent jolt. Below, forests, villages, and winding roads slowly drifted upward. The war suddenly seemed much quieter, much larger, much more dangerous. Because now, he wasn't an American fighter pilot anymore. He was a lone Allied airman descending directly into Nazi Germany. Carr landed hard in an open field. He quickly gathered his parachute before anyone could spot its bright white fabric. Training immediately took over. First, hide the parachute. Second, orient yourself. Third, move. Never remain near the landing site. German patrols often reached downed airmen within minutes. He buried portions of the parachute beneath loose earth and scattered leaves over the rest. Then he checked his emergency survival kit. A small map, compass, escape money, water purification tablets, chocolate. Almost nothing else. His pistol had been lost during the bailout. He was now deep behind enemy lines, alone. For the next several hours, Carr traveled almost exclusively through forests and hedgerows. Whenever he heard vehicles, he froze. Whenever dogs barked in the distance, he changed direction. German roadblocks appeared everywhere. Military trucks passed frequently. Twice, he narrowly avoided local civilians gathering firewood. Not everyone inside Germany supported the Nazi regime. But one frightened farmer could unintentionally end his freedom simply by reporting an unfamiliar stranger. Every decision mattered. Every footprint mattered. Every minute increased the chances of capture. As darkness approached, Carr finally stopped beside a wooded hillside overlooking a small valley. There, something immediately caught his attention. Hidden among rows of camouflage netting stood several aircraft. Not bombers. Not transports. Fighters. Even from a distance, he recognized their unmistakable silhouettes. A German airfield. He counted carefully. More than a dozen aircraft sat dispersed along the perimeter. Ground crews moved lazily between them. Fuel trucks remained parked nearby. The base appeared operational. Most escaped prisoners would have avoided such a place at all costs. Bruce Carr stared at it for several long moments. Then an idea slowly formed. It sounded completely insane. Exactly the kind of idea everyone else would dismiss immediately. He smiled. Because throughout his life, those had often been his favorite kind. November 4th, 1944. Somewhere inside Germany. The first light of dawn slowly revealed the German airfield below. Hidden among rows of pine trees, Bruce W. Carr remained completely motionless. He had spent the freezing night beneath a thick layer of fallen leaves, sleeping only a few minutes at a time. Every unfamiliar sound had forced him awake. Truck engines. Voices. Dogs barking somewhere beyond the tree line. Once, he heard German soldiers walking so close that he could distinguish individual footsteps. Fortunately, they never looked down. Now, in the gray morning light, He studied the airfield more carefully. What he saw changed everything. The base wasn't heavily defended. It wasn't abandoned either. It looked routine. Ground crews pushed fuel carts between aircraft. Mechanics removed engine panels. Several pilots stood outside a briefing hut smoking cigarettes. No one appeared alarmed. No one expected an escaped American pilot to be watching them from only a few hundred yards away. Carr smiled to himself. The Germans believed their greatest protection was distance. In reality, it was confidence. He carefully counted the aircraft. Several Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. A few training aircraft. Then, near the edge of the field, one Focke-Wulf FW-190, its engine cowling stood open. Mechanics worked around it for nearly an hour. Carr watched every movement. Eventually, the engine panels were secured. One mechanic started the engine briefly. It ran smoothly. Another pilot climbed inside for what appeared to be a systems check. A few minutes later, he climbed back out. The fighter remained parked, fueled, operational, ready to fly. Most men in Bruce Carr's position would have continued moving toward Allied lines. It was the logical choice, the safest choice. But Carr began calculating something entirely different. How long would it take to reach England on foot? Weeks, maybe months. How many German patrols stood between him and freedom? Hundreds. What were the odds of surviving that journey? Not good. Then another thought entered his mind. The airplane sitting below could cover the same distance in less than an hour. The idea sounded ridiculous, which was exactly why it might work. There remained one enormous problem. He didn't simply need to steal the airplane. He had to reach it first. The airfield remained full of German personnel. Any one of them could stop him. Carr spent the next several hours observing routines. When did the mechanics eat? Which guards actually paid attention? Where did trucks enter the field? Which sections received the least supervision? Pilots are trained to recognize patterns in the sky. Now, he searched for patterns on the ground. Late that morning, opportunity finally appeared. A fuel truck rolled toward the dispersal area where the FW-190 waited. Several mechanics followed behind it carrying equipment. For a brief moment, nearly everyone nearby faced away from the parked fighter. Carr immediately began moving. Not running. Walking, confidently. That detail mattered. People notice someone running. They rarely notice someone who appears to belong. His greatest advantage wasn't a weapon. It wasn't camouflage. It was psychology. German soldiers expected Allied prisoners to hide, to crawl, to panic, not to calmly walk across an operational Luftwaffe airfield. Carr kept his head down. Purposeful, neither hurried nor hesitant. One mechanic glanced toward him, then looked away, apparently satisfied that the unfamiliar figure belonged somewhere else on the base. Another soldier shouted something in German. Carr kept walking. The words meant nothing to him. Stopping would have been worse than ignoring them. The soldier eventually turned back toward his own work. The deception had survived its first test. The FW-190 now stood directly ahead. Only yards separated Carr from the cockpit. He reached the aircraft. Placed one hand on the wing. Still. No alarm. No shouting. He climbed into the cockpit. Immediately another obstacle appeared. The controls looked familiar enough. Throttle. Stick. Pedals. but labels throughout the cockpit appeared entirely in German. Carr had never trained in a German fighter. He only understood airplanes. Fortunately, airplanes often spoke the same language. He worked quickly. Battery. Fuel. Ignition. Engine controls. Years of experience flying fighters allowed him to recognize most systems almost instinctively. He silently thanked every instructor who had ever forced student pilots to understand machines instead of merely operating them. Outside, the mechanics remained busy loading equipment onto another aircraft. No one looked his way. Carr took one slow breath, then pressed the starter. The engine hesitated, coughed, stopped. His heart nearly did the same. A nearby mechanic turned. He stared toward the fighter. Carr remained perfectly still. For several endless seconds, nothing happened. The mechanic shrugged, perhaps assuming another pilot had experienced a routine starting problem. He returned to his work. Carr immediately tried again. This time, the powerful BMW radial engine roared to life. The entire aircraft vibrated beneath him. Now everyone looked. Several mechanics smiled and waved casually, apparently believing one of their own pilots had finally received permission to depart. Carr actually returned the wave. Years later, he admitted that this moment felt almost surreal. He was sitting inside a German fighter, surrounded by Germans, and nobody suspected anything. He slowly released the brakes. The FW-190 began taxiing toward the runway. No one stopped him. No one challenged him. The control tower gave what appeared to be a routine departure signal. Carr couldn't understand the radio transmissions. He didn't need to. He simply followed the aircraft already using the taxiway. The hardest part wasn't flying. It was pretending to belong. Then came the runway. The final point of no return. Carr pushed the throttle forward. The engine responded immediately. Acceleration pressed him back into the seat. The fighter raced across the concrete. Faster. Faster. Within seconds, the wheels left the ground. Bruce Carr was airborne. Inside Germany, flying a German fighter. For one glorious moment, he allowed himself to believe the impossible plan had actually worked. Then he looked behind him. Several figures pointed toward the climbing aircraft. One truck accelerated toward the runway. Another fighter's engine suddenly came to life. Someone had finally realized what was happening. And now, every German pilot within range would be looking for a stolen FW-190 heading west. November 4th, 1944. The wheels of the Focke-Wulf FW-190 had barely left the runway when Bruce W. Carr realized the most dangerous part of his escape had only just begun. Stealing the airplane had been nearly impossible. Flying it across Germany would be even harder. Every radar station below believed he was a German pilot. That worked in his favor. For now. But the moment the theft was discovered, every Luftwaffe unit within radio range would receive the same message. One of their own fighters had been stolen. The pilot was American. Shoot it down. Carr kept the aircraft low. Very low. Years of flying combat missions had taught him that altitude offered visibility, but also exposure. Instead of climbing high above the countryside, he skimmed over forests, rivers, and farmland. Church steeples flashed past only a few hundred feet below. Small villages disappeared beneath the wings almost before he could recognize them. Every minute carried him farther from the airfield. Yet he knew distance alone wouldn't save him. Sooner or later, Someone would come looking. The cockpit felt strangely unfamiliar. Unlike his beloved North American P-51 Mustang, the FW-190 responded differently to almost every control input. The engine produced a deeper vibration. The instruments were arranged according to German engineering rather than American habits. Every gauge was labeled in a language he couldn't read. Instead of relying on words, Carr relied on instinct. Engine sound, aircraft vibration, control pressure. Experienced pilots often said an airplane spoke to you. You simply had to learn how to listen. Fortunately, airplanes sounded remarkably similar in every language. Several minutes passed without incident. Carr almost began believing the impossible had become reality. Then, movement. High above his left wing. Two dark specks. They grew rapidly. German fighters. Whether they had been searching specifically for him or simply happened to cross his path hardly mattered. If they approached closely enough, the deception would end immediately. Carr forced himself not to panic. He remembered something veteran fighter pilots often discussed. Enemy aircraft rarely attracted attention by behaving normally. They attracted attention by behaving strangely. So, he continued flying exactly as a German pilot might. Steady heading. No abrupt turns. No desperate dives. No attempt to flee. For several long seconds, the two fighters remained above him. Then, without changing course, they continued east. Carr slowly released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Sometimes the greatest victory in combat came from never being noticed at all. The farther west he flew, the more complicated the situation became. German anti-aircraft batteries covered nearly every important road and bridge. From the ground, crews would naturally assume the approaching fighter belonged to the Luftwaffe. That helped. Until it didn't. Friendly fire had become a constant danger for every air force during the war. A nervous gun crew. A mistaken identification. One inaccurate report. Any of them could end the journey instantly. Carr constantly adjusted altitude and direction, avoiding major cities whenever possible. He trusted isolation more than populated areas. Hours earlier, he had drifted helplessly beneath a parachute. Now, he raced across occupied Europe at hundreds of miles per hour. The contrast almost seemed unbelievable. He thought briefly about the German mechanics. By now, they had certainly discovered the missing fighter. The commander of the airfield was probably answering uncomfortable questions. How could an escaped American pilot simply walk onto the base, start one of Germany's finest fighters, and fly away? Carr almost laughed. Not because the situation was funny. Because it was absurd. War often rewarded the plan nobody expected. Then came another challenge. The front line. From the air, identifying exactly where Germany ended and Allied-controlled territory began wasn't easy. Smoke from artillery covered much of the landscape. Roads overflowed with military vehicles moving in both directions. Destroyed bridges crossed muddy rivers. Every army looked remarkably similar from several thousand feet. Carr needed to avoid one disastrous mistake. If Allied anti-aircraft crews recognized the aircraft as German before recognizing the pilot, they would do exactly what they had been trained to do. Destroy it. As he approached the Allied advance, he began rocking the wings gently. Then again. He lowered the landing gear briefly before raising it once more. Pilots occasionally used unusual maneuvers to attract attention and signal friendly intentions. There was no guarantee anyone would understand. But it was better than arriving silently in an enemy fighter. Almost immediately, Anti-aircraft guns began tracking him. Carr could actually see several batteries rotating below. He resisted every instinct to turn away. Turning would only confirm suspicion. Instead, he continued directly toward Allied lines. For several agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, the guns remained silent. Someone below had hesitated. Perhaps an experienced officer recognized that something about the approaching fighter didn't make sense. Perhaps they simply chose not to fire. Whatever the reason, Bruce Carr crossed into Allied territory alive. Only now did he finally believe he might actually make it home. Finding a suitable airfield proved easier than expected. He spotted an Allied fighter base already busy with returning aircraft. Several mechanics looked skyward as the unfamiliar silhouette approached. Confusion spread almost instantly. Ground crews pointed toward the incoming fighter. Pilots stopped what they were doing. Everyone recognized the aircraft. A German FW-190. The question was obvious. Why was it landing here? Carr lowered the landing gear. The aircraft touched the runway surprisingly smoothly. He taxied toward the edge of the field. Dozens of armed soldiers immediately surrounded the fighter. Machine guns remained aimed directly at the cockpit. Nobody intended to take chances. The engine shut down. Silence returned. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the canopy opened. Out climbed an American pilot wearing a United States Army Air Force's flight suit. The expressions on the faces of the waiting soldiers changed instantly. One mechanic later recalled that it took several seconds before anyone even remembered to speak. An intelligence officer hurried toward the aircraft. What happened? Carr reportedly answered with characteristic simplicity. They shot down my Mustang. He paused. So I borrowed this. Laughter spread across the flight line. Disbelief quickly followed. Within hours, the story raced through Allied squadrons across Europe. Some assumed it had been exaggerated. Others refused to believe it entirely until they saw the German fighter parked beside American Mustangs. There it was. Proof made of steel and aluminum. The captured FW-190 became more than just an extraordinary souvenir. Intelligence officers carefully examined every instrument, radio, and mechanical component. Engineers studied German design choices. Pilots compared its handling characteristics with Allied fighters. Although the Luftwaffe had already lost much of its former strength, by late 1944, every intact enemy aircraft remained an invaluable source of technical intelligence. Bruce Carr hadn't merely escaped. He had delivered one of Germany's own fighters into Allied hands. The rest of the war brought Carr additional combat missions and victories. But this remarkable escape became the defining story of his career. It perfectly captured the qualities his fellow pilots admired most. Confidence. Calm under pressure. A willingness to attempt what everyone else considered impossible. Military historians still regard the incident as one of the most daring individual escapes by an Allied fighter pilot during the Second World War. Not because Bruce Carr defeated an entire squadron. Not because he won a spectacular dogfight. But because he understood that sometimes the safest path home wasn't the obvious one. It was the one no enemy could imagine. Looking back today, it is tempting to describe Bruce Carr as fearless. The historical record suggests something more interesting. Like nearly every combat pilot, he understood fear perfectly well. What separated him from many others was his response to it. When his Mustang fell from the sky, he didn't surrender to circumstances. He observed. He planned. He waited. And when opportunity appeared, he acted without hesitation. That combination of patience and audacity accomplished something extraordinary. Thousands of Allied pilots escaped enemy territory during the war. Very few did it sitting in the cockpit of a German fighter. Bruce Carr didn't simply survive being shot down. He turned one of the worst days of his military career into one of the most unbelievable escape stories of World War II, a story that remains almost too incredible to be true, except that history recorded every remarkable step of it.